Okay, today I just wanted to go through some questions that's from comments and things on the YouTube channel, which just a couple of, or two or three that I wanted to go through in a bit more detail where I can answer to everyone as to my thoughts on that. First of all would be a very common question asked in all sorts of different ways, but what's the best calibre? There's a few different levels I'd go to try and answer that question. There is no such thing as the best calibre. There is no best calibre at all, in my opinion. The best calibre is as many rifles as you can afford that what suit you, and get a range of them. But beyond that point, without going down trying to be a salesman for gun dealers in this world, my comment really comes into if you're doing something like you're hunting, you're target shooting, you're doing something that is a particular sport or activity you want to do, then those are very important details to consider. So when someone says what's the best calibre for long range hunting, understand something. That isn't actually a question by itself. Might sound like it is, but long range hunting means what are the animal you're actually hunting, what are the ranges you're really talking about, what are the conditions you actually have to deal with. There's lots of details that go with that. And my simple answer to any of those sort of questions when it is about hunting or a specific thing is talk to the people in your area that are doing that side of things. So whether that's forums, and that's how as closely connected you are, whether there's local clubs, whether there's local hunters, whether there's, go and talk to those people, find out what they're using, keep an open mind about things in the way of, and then you may have some finer details to ask to try and help with those decisions. But as a general side of things, if it is hunting, you're elk hunting and you're going to be shooting 300 to 600 yards is the sort of thing you're doing, then that is not a question, a general question for the internet. That is a question of your area, the type of conditions you're shooting through, the type of what it actually needs, what size the general animal you're trying to take down is to versus what calibre you're going to use. So not a general question, very much a specific question, and really ask of the people that are doing that side of things. In the way of target shooting, when it comes to going to a club, you'll find there are specific details that are involved in that as well. Now that may be a case of all sorts of different ranges that are relevant, but also the conditions you have to shoot with. Are you allowed to shoot a muzzle brake? Are you not allowed to shoot a muzzle brake? Or is it just frowned upon? Is it not always the best rifle is the one that you really want to have? You know, in the way of going into a club situation, to go into the best rifle and only end up being an average shooter is, in my opinion at least, not the ideal way to do it. You go in with a good competitive calibre, but it is not the top of the pile, and you are shooting in the where you shoot quite well in the middle of things. That's a prouder situation to be in than having the absolute best rifle and only being able to be semi-competitive. And I hope you get where I'm coming from on that angle. There is lots of different details. No point getting a 338 to go and shoot 1,000 yards. It might seem a smart idea because you've got a very accurate rifle over that range, but you find you're not allowed to use a muzzle brake. You've just got yourself a handful. And as we've shown on our channel, you can shoot a 223 accurately to 1,000 yards. And once again, a little bit of that competition thing. You have a 338 and you're only pulling in a 6-inch group at 1,000 yards, and someone's got a 223 and shooting a 4-inch group at 1,000 yards. Who do you reckon feels better in that conversation? So into the next one, which is probably the real reason I'm making this this conversation, is what's the best calibre to start with? I want to get into long range target shooting. What's the best calibre to start with? What's the best calibre for that? And there's a couple of ways of looking at that conversation. The truth of it is the most efficient gun to shoot 800 1,000 yards, 600 to 1,000 yards. The most efficient rounds are in a semi-sized calibre. So we're talking in the 308 parent case is a very good size, but we're fitting into that from the very popular, overrated a little bit in my opinion, 6.5 Creedmoor, to the 243, an underrated great calibre. The 308 doesn't do a bad job. The 260 Remington, another awesome calibre. All those side of things up to the 300 Win Mags and down to, like I said, the 223. What's the best choice? The most efficient, yes, is in your 6.5s and 6 mils is the most efficient at getting it done. In an out-and-out competition where everything counts and you're doing your absolute best, it's probably the best choice. But is it the best choice for a first-off shooter? Well, my opinion, no. The way I would do it is different than that. The way I would do it is I would choose less than the best choice to make me a better shooter. If I'm using a 260 Remington, awesome round for doing that sort of shot, or 243, awesome round for doing that sort of shot. 165, 1.6, similar amount of powder, very efficient bullet at that time, not too much recoil. Because they're so efficient and fast, not too much deflection with wind, you don't have to allow so much, all sounds great. But the truth of it is something like the 308, which is something that's being a little bit frowned upon nowadays because it isn't so efficient, it actually makes you a better shooter. When you learn to have to compensate, when your learning is done in a harder fashion, the most likely is that you're going to learn better. So even the 243, even the 223, which has very similar efficiencies, very similar flight times and trajectories and wind compensations to the likes of the 308. And what I'm talking about there with the 223 is not shooting a 45 grain bullet. I'm talking shooting a 75 or an 80 grain bullet. So we're talking a 223 with a 1 in 8 twist, and a 308 with a 1 in 12 or down to 1 in 10 twist. You're shooting 175 grain bullet, 168, 175 grain bullet. They are both very good, very accurate rifles at that range, but they have a disadvantage in their efficiencies at getting to that range. So that means if you've got wind blowing, you've got more compensation. My call on starting is that that's quite a good place to start. You have to learn to get good group sizes, you have to learn to read your conditions better. And my way of doing things is bite off a bit more and chew a bit harder. It'll make a better shooter of you in the long run. Doesn't suit all people. You just want to go and do the absolute best you can, then yes, the 6 mils and the 6.5s are going to do a more efficient job, and you don't have the time for training, you don't really practice, you already know as much you want the most efficient max rifle, then that's a different place. My conversation is about learning and becoming better as a shooter. But it is also definitely done down the consideration that you're going to get another rifle. And to be truthful, if you're going to do a lot of shooting, you're either going to be rebuilding that rifle with barrels and bits and pieces periodically, or you're going to get multiple rifles. You're going to get another one and probably another one after that. So then it all has to be taken into consideration. You know, if there's one rifle only, I'm only going to shoot a certain amount, what's the best choice? The truth of it, there isn't one. You have to take all those things into consideration. Another thing that's raised on that score is the likes of barrel wear. And what rifles, how many rounds does it take to wear a rifle on Excalibur? There is a general rule of thumb, but it is completely negated by how you shoot your rifle. There are rifles, there are the likes of 300 Win Mags that have done 4,000 rounds and still shoot okay. There's the likes of the same caliber, a 300 Win Mag that has been worn out at 1,000 rounds. Now obviously, how hot you're running your load, what sort of powder you're using, how rapid fire, how much rapid fire you do, how hot your barrel gets, what sort of conditions you shoot in, are all very relevant, how it's maintained, all that sort of stuff. What I'm really trying to say to that, without mentioning any more calibers, is that yes, largely a faster moving bullet with more powder, so high pressure round, will tend to wear out the barrel faster. But don't overthink it. It does come down to how you use it. If you're rapid fire, lots of matches, you go through and shoot 1,000 rounds in a weekend, hey listen, it's an issue for you. If you are a plinker, or you go and do some shots where you'll go and do, like some of our long range stuff, we'll go and do 20 or 25 rounds, and maybe over a month we'll get 100 rounds shot and then not shoot it again for 3 months with using different rifles, the barrel life isn't a huge issue. It also isn't quite as people think. Barrel life isn't just a case it gets a bit worn, it starts spraying bullets all over the place. The main thing that happens, even if you lose the first 3 or 4 inches of rifling, as it wears, as those gases come out and wear those bits of rifling out, what will happen is you'll lose bullet speed. And you can start to open up your extreme spread. You lose your pressures become less consistent in what's shooting. You can actually push your build out a little bit, go through and reset it up to the lands and start to correct that a little bit, but it is not something that is a drastic issue or to be too concerned about. Also, a barrel isn't that expensive to replace, but it is not a deal breaker in most places. Another thing that we're asked very, very frequently, and all the regular viewers would know, but is the iPhone app that we use, and that is this. I'll let it open up so you can see, but that is this app here, which is, if you read up here, it says, for all those people, it says measuring tape. That's what it's called. It is just for iPhone, for what I understand. It is a GPS app, so it actually reads GPS. They basically use the GPS clocks. And from what we've seen, the simple truth of it is we have not done any testing with any other apps for that job. We found this one. Maybe did some testing a long time ago trying to find something, but we found this one that works well. We actually, when we did test this one, we had essentially where we used to regularly have a Garmin GPS unit that was a good accurate unit that we'd use, but it wasn't as clear or give quite the fineness of gradients, so you could actually it was harder to get the exact measurements, but it was a GPS one and it was verified all the time with it. The other thing we do constantly, when I go and find a long range area to shoot, I use the likes of Google Earth, and I use another program that I go through and actually find those spots, identify where the spot is. If I can't find that spot, I'll find something else and measure it with the likes of that as well. And not everything's precise, but we're always in the amalgam of all the bits and pieces. They're within sort of 20 yards of each other. They're really, you couldn't tell more accurately than that, but it's down to basically a point where I trust this as to being fairly finely accurate. And this app will tell you, it says what accuracy it's got. This one says generally between 1 and 3 meters, and that's what we'll get as repeatability. There are some different locations where we'll find that you're out to 5 and 10 meters of accuracy, and I presume it gets worse than that depending on where the GPS clocks are, where things are around with what you're using. But what we've found is it's great. From what I know, once again, haven't tested, it's only on iPhone. And I would say, out of the logic of what it is, this is just simply a measuring tape app that's using GPS. I would think there's another 100 of them that you can. This one, like I said, we have not tested beyond that point. We've found it's accurate. I verified occasionally. We take the other GPS, the Garmin out there. We're always verifying and finding our maps to make sure it makes sense on the likes of Google Earth, that sort of stuff. But yes, it's the measuring tape app. And we've found it super handy. It's the other reason we're using it is it's nice, big and easy to read on the camera, so it gives a nice, simple, quick verification of what distance we're actually shooting and why we use it. I'm sure there's lots of others out there that do just as good. It's simply what we've used, and I'm very much a candidate of the don't fix what ain't broke. Anyway, that's on that one. Okay. Another one that I've been asked to comment on a few times, and that is Magnum primers. I suppose there's a little bit of misconception that goes with Magnum primers. Some people already know this, some people don't. The most common misperception of Magnum primers is that Magnum primers are for Magnum rounds. Listen, it's the same word, but it isn't the case at all. Magnum primers and Magnum rounds, regardless of what they're designed for, what I'm going to go through, what I've found with them. Magnum primers are a more powerful primer that burn things faster. And generally, I find them a negative. Generally, I don't use a Magnum primer. I do not use, or have used, I generally do not use a Magnum primer in even as big as the 3.3 outlet puller. And without getting too technical about that, the process is that what a Magnum primer is actually for is simply a larger powder to burn faster, to ignite slower burning powders. Larger amounts of slow burning powders. That seems like a good thing, and in cases you can use it to give yourself more when you're struggling with case pressures or with case capacity and not running enough pressure. Then the likes of Magnum primer can add, and there's, I've read stuff talking about adding 1.5 to 2 grains of powder essentially in its power. I would say, from what I've seen, the little testing I've done with it, is it's around 5% is what you actually get out of it. So that means that essentially in a 40 grain load, you're going to gain a little bit under 2 grains of powder, 1.5 grains of powder. In a 95 grain load, you're going to gain closer to 5 grains of powder in the way of your pressure, in analysing the pressure side of things. And you gain a certain amount of speed to that. But there's quite a big negative, in my experience, to go with a negative primer, to go with a Magnum primer. And that is, it actually burns a lot faster, a lot more aggressive shot, and a lot more aggressive whack that actually happens. And in some rifles, it's actually discernible. You'll feel it. In most, I feel, you can actually feel it. It's a sharper crack. Now, in the theory of making it go fast and bang out that barrel fast, that's all good. I find it's a negative. It's a little bit like good fuel versus bad fuel. Good stuff actually is a slower, smoother burn. The smoother that gets it, the ideal, the most accurate gun in the world will be a gun that has no recoil to it and fires the bullet off at 3,500 feet per second. If that didn't recoil, if it didn't move, you'd just be able to point it and shoot it. So coming back down to reality, the more aggressive the bang, the more aggressive that crack is when you pull the trigger, the less accurate the rifle's going to be. So a softer start, the normal large rifle, we use match, I use the Federal large rifle gold medal match primers, is what I use, and I find it is discernible. You can just feel it's a little bit smoother in the way of things, and I find it makes my pressures a little more stable. I tend to be running a little bit more powder because of it. I'm not struggling. I'm running compressed loads, but I'm not struggling with fitting the powder in, and I find a nicer shot, nicer groups out of doing it that way. Largely I'm not a group shooter, largely I'm sort of but way out there dealing with all sorts of conditions. I find it more stable to use and nicer to use. You may actually find a place, I don't know it, but with the right powder where you can run a Magnum primer in a 308 round because of the type of powder you're trying to burn and how irregularly it burns. But with a good powder, a good stable powder, if you can get enough in and make it burn properly with just a large rifle primer, then that's where I go, because it'll be smoother and nicer to shoot. Now, last thing I want to touch on, I've touched on it once before, and that is for some people there is a question of Coriolis and how we deal with Coriolis. I think for some people the thought of Coriolis is the bullet constantly moves to a different place than you thought it was going to, because the earth's rotating. Listen, it isn't the case. It isn't the nature of the beast. There is a whole bunch of people that would suggest that it doesn't work. If you're shooting from one point on a rotating spear, everything's going to rotate together, so you shouldn't have to allow for it. The truth of it is, where Coriolis comes from is not our shooting world. Coriolis comes from the logic of things travelling differently once they're shot off our spear, off the earth, and by the time they come back down, they're coming to a different point of re-entry. Is not driven out of what we've done in a rifle shooting sense. It's driven out of artillery shooting 9 miles and 10 miles and further, where they really do have the ability to say that it's moving a long way from where we first aimed it. My comment would be, don't worry about it on a shooting perspective. When you're shooting an extremely long way, if it's a one-shot hit, you're trying to get everything spot on, yes, okay, it's relevant. The truth of it is, you're shooting 3,000 or 2,500, even 2,000 yards, one-shot's hits are very, very, for the very, very experienced, and there's a lot more going on than dealing with something as simple as a little bit of movement, 1.5 minutes of correction from Coriolis. Reading your wind, understanding your barometric pressures, understanding your different air densities, understanding all those things have far more relevance on it. The only place that I find Coriolis is relevant is in your final recording of things, so that then you can get true data. So you're allowing for it in that point. I believe that it's worthwhile considering it exists. Proving it, another factor with our rifles, is a lot harder to do. There's a lot more conditions going on, like I said. But by recording it at the end of the day and putting that into my factors as to my data I get out is then clean data that allows for everything I can measure on that day, gives me more chance of being able to repeat that. And yes, when we do pull off a one-shot hit, or when we get within 1 metre on a 3,000 yard shot with our first shot, that is factored in as part of it. But don't consider it something to have to worry about where you're shooting to. It's going to keep changing your path of your bullet. Once one shot is fired and you've seen where it's impacted, you're correcting to that. If you're shooting in the same direction, Coriolis is not going to change things beyond that point. You are correcting to it once you're correcting from that first impact. So anyway, that's listen, the ones that are in my head anyway, the ones that I can think of right now, those are some questions that I have been frequently asked and are not as simple as a few paragraphs in the way of answering a comment. And I've said I might do a video on that. Well, here's a video on that, and I hope that answers some questions. Otherwise, guys, you'll see we've got another lot of our shirts in. We've got our site up, that's up and alive with our bag bases and muzzle brakes, and we've got a range of shirts and our data recordings, books and that sort of stuff's all there. So check it out if you're interested. And otherwise, once again, thanks for checking us out, and we'll catch you next time.